I still remember the sound of sirens mixed with the smell of rain in Detroit. The streets always seemed weary, as if they held too many stories to tell. I grew up there, among gray buildings and brave hearts, watching my mother transform hardness into tenderness. Diana was the kind of woman who smiled even in the worst storms. And I thought if I could be half as good as she was, that would be enough. Life didn't give us much, but she always found a way to make it seem like enough. We had little, but love. Oh, love overflowed in every detail. I'd see her come home from work with chapped hands, her apron stained with soap, and yet still smiling as if she'd conquered the world. "Everything will be okay, Rachel," she'd say, and I believed her. Maybe that's why, from an early age, I learned not to give up. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also want to take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me a lot, thank you. Now, let me tell you how it all began, because sometimes, the greatest pain blossoms from the purest intentions. When I was little, I believed love was like the bedtime stories my mother read me. There was always a happy ending, even after 1,000 tears. I clung to these stories like someone clinging to a plank at sea. And without realizing it, I began writing my own story with the same naivete, believing that all it took was love for everything to work out. Detroit was cold in winter, but Mom's kitchen was warm. The smell of apple pie and the sound of the kettle boiling created a kind of invisible refuge. Sometimes I closed my eyes and pretended we lived somewhere else, where bills didn't pile up on the table and where neighbors didn't scream at night. One day, we'll get out of here, I promised myself. Mom said faith was the blanket of the soul. And when the world's cold tried to paralyze me, it was faith that warmed me. On Sundays, we went to church wearing the same old dress, patchwork, but clean. I sang the hymns with all my heart, as if every note were a promise from God that everything would change. And, in a way, it did. When I turned 15, I started working at a downtown bakery. The smell of fresh bread and fresh coffee was my new home. The customers were friendly, some lonely, others generous enough to leave me tips that seemed like miracles. It was there that I learned the value of every penny, and every kind word. Diana, my mother, always said, "A woman's character is tested when no one is looking." I didn't fully understand what she meant until the day I had to choose between telling the truth and keeping my job. I told the truth. And I was fired. She hugged me, cried with me, and said, "You lost your job, but you saved your soul." I never forgot. There was something magical about the way Mom turned failures into lessons. When money was tight, she'd say, "God is teaching us to wait." When the rent was late, she'd pray, "Lord, you know what we do with love." And, like a miracle in disguise, help always appeared from somewhere. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was faith. Today I believe it was God Himself testing our hope. I used to watch the perfect families in the wealthy neighborhood across town. New cars, big houses, laughter at Sunday dinners. For a while, I thought that was what happiness was all about. But one day, I saw one of those boys crying alone at the gate of a mansion. That's when I realized, no one is untouched by pain. Not even those who have everything. At school I was shy. I spoke little, dreamed a lot. I loved writing in old notebooks my mother brought from the community library. There, I created worlds where no one screamed, no one went hungry, no one disappeared without explanation. Maybe it was my way of escaping. Or maybe it was God teaching me that words can also save. But not everything was dreams and hope. Sometimes, loneliness would arrive suddenly, like a silent shadow. I'd watch the other girls talk about their parents casually, while my name wasn't even mentioned. Mom would say he wasn't ready to be a father, and I'd pretend to understand. But deep down, it hurt. It hurt more than I could admit. Growing up without a father made me strong, but also suspicious. I looked at men with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Were they all like him? Would they all leave? I promised myself I would never let anyone make me feel small. Little did I know that this promise would one day be cruelly tested. Sometimes at night, I would hear Mom crying softly. She thought I was asleep, but I heard every sob. And each one planted a silent determination within me. I would be no one's source of tears. I would make her proud, no matter what. It was a girlish promise. And promises made in childhood carry a strange, almost sacred power. The summer I turned 16, Mom got sick. Working 2 jobs had taken its toll. I became an adult overnight. I cooked, cleaned, paid bills. Sometimes she'd say weakly, "Rachel, never forget. True love never hurts." I didn't know why she said it, but I kept it in my mind. And one day I would understand. While the other teenagers went to parties, I took care of her. And, strangely, I didn't mind. Because there was a peace in that quiet routine. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint Detroit gold. She'd hold my hand and say, "You have something special, daughter. Something the world will try to erase. Protect it." It was also during this time that I learned to truly pray. Not those rehearsed Sunday prayers, but the ones born of desperation, when you don't know what to say and just cry. I discovered that God doesn't need pretty words. He only wants sincerity. And perhaps that's why I always felt he heard me, even when I didn't say anything. One night, I woke up startled. I had a dream in which my mother disappeared into the mist. The next day she hugged me tightly and said, "If one day I'm not here, remember that God will be." I laughed, thinking it was silly. But deep inside me, something shifted. It was as if my heart knew childhood was about to end. Mom passed away a year later. A sudden stroke. I remember the smell of the hospital, the sound of the monitor beeping, her hands growing cold. The world went silent. People spoke to me, but all I saw were lips moving. The love of my life was gone, and I became an orphan of everything, even myself. After the funeral, I sat in the empty room and found a note from her hidden in the drawer. "Rachel, don't be afraid. You were made to start over." These words became my beacon. I repeated them like a psalm. I was made to start over. And somehow, they kept me from falling apart. From then on, I started working double shifts. I washed dishes at a restaurant during the day and cleaned offices at night. Detroit seemed colder without her, but the memory of her smile warmed what was left of me. Sometimes I'd look up at the sky and say, "Mom, I'm trying." And I swear I felt the wind respond. It was during this time that I discovered true loneliness. Not the kind that aches in the body, but the kind that weighs on the soul. I saw couples walking hand in hand and wondered if someone would ever look at me that way, with tenderness, with care. And even without knowing it, I began to dream of the love that would one day be my salvation, or my downfall. A pastor at church once told me, "Rachel, God never wastes pain." I didn't understand at the time, but now I see he was right. Every tear, every loss, every sleepless night, it was all a silent preparation for something greater. I just didn't yet know how much that lesson would cost. My mother always said that good people attract love, but also envy and danger. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant by danger. I was just a dreamy girl, believing the world rewarded good. Little did I know that evil also knows how to smile. Time passed, and I began attending church alone. I sang, helped in the choir, and distributed pamphlets in the neighborhood. People said I looked strong, but inside, I was all longing and hope. I asked God for a sign. A new beginning. A purpose. And he sent it. But in a way I could never have imagined. It was on a rainy afternoon that I first saw him. Tall, polite, with that kind of look that makes you believe you're safe. Ryan. The name rang with promise. He held my umbrella when the wind nearly blew it away, and laughed in a way that made me forget the cold. In that moment I thought, maybe he's the fresh start God promised. But something about her smile made me uneasy, though I didn't know why. It was like a note off key in a perfect song. Still, I wanted to believe. Because when we come from such emptiness, any kindness seems like a miracle. And that's how my heart began to open the door, without knowing who was truly on the other side. I was young, dreamy, and alone. He was thoughtful, devout, and charming. The people at church admired him, and this only reinforced the idea that he was the right man. After all, if everyone saw him as a good Christian, who was I to doubt? It's funny how faith sometimes makes us close our eyes when we should most open them. But back then, all I wanted was to love, and be loved. I believed God had finally answered my prayers. Ryan seemed like the perfect gift after so many winters. But, as my mother used to say, not all gifts come from God. Some are tests, disguised as blessings. And so it was, with a heart full of hope and my eyes blindfolded by innocence, that I took the first step toward the love that would change everything. A love that began as salvation but would end as a sentence. I married too young. I was only 17, and I thought I knew what love was. Ryan made me feel seen, important, almost sacred. When he proposed, I said yes without a second thought. It was as if God had finally rewarded me for all the years of loneliness. The wedding took place in a small church in Detroit, with artificial flowers and true promises. Mom was no longer there, but I swear I felt her presence in the air. As I said, "I do," I imagined her beaming from heaven, proud. I believed with all my heart that this was the beginning of a blessed life. For the first few months, everything seemed like a dream. The small house, the borrowed couch, the laughter in the middle of the night. Ryan called me my miracle, and I believed him. I woke up every day grateful, believing that love was simple. Caring, laughing, forgiving, starting over. When I found out I was pregnant with Alex, I cried with joy. He cried too, at least that night. I remember the way he held me, promising that nothing in the world would separate us. It was the kind of promise you make looking someone in the eye, with your whole soul. And in that moment, I believed every word. Our home was modest, but full of hope. The sound of the radio playing oldies, the smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings, the baby's cries mingling with laughter. There was something sacred about watching Ryan rock the cradle. He seemed so loving, so devoted, that I didn't even notice the first signs of what was to come. When Kayla was born, life got busier, but also sweeter. I loved being a mom. I loved watching Ryan throw the kids in the air and laugh out loud as if the whole world fit inside our living room. He was the father I never had. And for a while, that was enough to make me happy. It was during this period that he began attending church more. He became the leader of the couples group. People admired him. A man of exemplary faith, they said. I felt pride, and a certain fear too, though I couldn't explain it. It was as if something inside him was changing. Slowly, silently, like a dark tide rising without warning. After Emily, our third daughter, things started to go downhill. Ryan became more distant, more demanding. He said I'd let myself go, that I wasn't the same woman anymore. I tried to understand, tried to please. But it seemed like every gesture I made irritated him a little more. Still, I tried hard to keep the house light. I baked cakes on Sundays, prepared candlelit dinners, even if he came home late. I believed that love could heal what was broken. That all it took was prayer, patience, and God would fix everything. But some prayers. God answers with silence. The small criticisms turned into arguments. The arguments turned into yelling. And the yelling, well, I didn't know it yet, but it was just the beginning of something much bigger. He'd apologize later, hug me tightly, and say, "I only want the best for us." And I'd forgive him, because that's what good wives did. Sometimes he cried. He said he was overwhelmed, that work was pressing on him. I believed him because I wanted to believe. And because love, for me, had always meant endurance. I thought that was what Mom meant when she talked about true love, the kind that endures everything. But maybe I'd misunderstood. At the children's birthday parties, he seemed like a different man. Smiling, generous, playful. People looked at us and said, What a beautiful family. I smiled too, but inside, something hurt. It was like living in a perfect portrait that hid cracks only I could see. One night at dinner, Ryan complained about the rice. He said it was cold, that I didn't care anymore. I laughed, thinking he was joking. But his gaze, that icy gaze, made me shiver. "Don't laugh at me," he said. And in that simple sentence, something inside me cracked, a crack so thin I barely noticed. After that came the subtle requests. He'd say my hair would look better shorter. Then that I didn't need to wear makeup, because a woman of God doesn't paint herself. I obeyed, eager to please. And each concession felt like an act of love, until I realized it was a way of erasing who I was. My friends started disappearing. He'd say, "Married women don't need single friends." I'd give in, thinking he just wanted to protect our marriage. It was strange. The way he spoke seemed so convincing. And I, who'd always been strong, began to doubt my own strength. Little by little, I stopped going out. I stopped singing in the church choir. Even the living room mirror was covered with a towel. He said, vanity was a sin. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. But I clung to the idea that he would change, that the phase would pass. And by loving him too much, I became blind. Still, there were good times. He'd hold me at night and tell me I was all he had. And I believed him because love does that to us. It makes pain seem normal. Sometimes I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize myself. But I convinced myself it was just fatigue, just a phase. When Alex started school, Ryan became even more controlling. He wanted to know who my classmates' parents were, what I was saying to the teachers. He said he didn't trust anyone. And I thought this zeal, this concern, was beautiful. But love, when it suffocates, it's no longer love. One afternoon, he took me for a walk in the park. The leaves were falling, golden, and the wind carried that scent of autumn. He held my hand and told me he wanted to start over, that he loved me. I cried, overcome with emotion, thinking everything would go back to the way it was before. But the fresh start he promised never came. Over time, I noticed his tone of voice changing depending on the people around him. At church, he was sweet. At home, he was a stranger. I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to guess which version of him I would encounter each day. Fear began to live within me. Silent, patient, disguised as love. One night, after an argument, he slammed the door so hard the children woke up crying. He didn't touch me, but his silence was worse than a slap. That empty look. It was as if the man I loved had died. And suddenly, I realized, I was alone, even though I was married. But the most confusing thing of all was Sunday at church. He preached about love, forgiveness, and family. People cried, applauded, and were inspired. And I, sitting in the pew, looked at that man and thought, "Who are you?" I wanted to scream, but I kept quiet. Because no one would believe me. It was around this time that I started having nightmares. I dreamed I was trapped in a dark, windowless room, and that the more I screamed, the less sound came out of my mouth. I woke up sweating, terrified. And Ryan, beside me, slept peacefully. It was as if the darkness I felt was already part of him. Sometimes I looked at my children and wondered what they saw. Did they see the fear in my eyes? Did they understand the silence between us? I tried to protect them from everything, but how can you protect someone when you're trapped yourself? Still, there were days when I convinced myself he was good. That it was just the stress, the routine, the burden of supporting the household. Because accepting the truth hurt more than any slap. So I hid behind the excuses I made. And time passed, eroding what was left of me. With each passing year, he grew more severe. The laughter disappeared, the hugs became rare. The house, once full of life, became a minefield. And I, once so talkative, learned to measure each word. Because any wrong sentence could be the beginning of a new hell. But there was something even scarier. People thought I was happy. I smiled in photos, cooked at church dinners, participated in prayer campaigns. Inside, I was dying a little every day. And the cruelest thing of all, I no longer knew who I was. Sometimes I'd pick up my teenage diary and reread my old promises. I'll never let anyone make me feel small. And I'd cry. Because that's exactly what had happened. I'd lost myself trying to save someone who never wanted to be saved. One morning, while folding clothes, I heard Ryan humming in the bathroom. The melody was soft, almost innocent. But the words spoke of dominance, of possession. And in that instant, something inside me ignited, a spark of warning. It was a harbinger of what was yet to come. I don't know exactly when I started disappearing. Maybe it was little by little, between one request and another, a criticism, and a prolonged silence. Ryan said it was out of love, but love shouldn't hurt like this. Each day, a piece of me disappeared, and I didn't even realize how much I was losing myself. It all started with small details. He said he preferred my hair up, so I started wearing it that way every day. Then he asked me to stop wearing lipstick because it drew too much attention. I complied. I thought I was being a good wife. Deep down, I just wanted peace. Peace, however, was becoming increasingly precious. All it took was a crooked look, a misplaced word, and the mood would shift. He didn't always shout. Sometimes silence was enough. A silence so heavy that the air in the house seemed to still. And when he broke that silence, I already knew it would be my fault. I tried to justify it. I told myself it was stress, work, the pressures of life. I prayed for patience, believing God was testing me. Love is patient, I repeated, as if the verse were a shield. But what I didn't realize was that I no longer loved. I feared. Little by little, I stopped laughing. My children asked why I was always tired. I said it was housework, but that was a lie. I was tired of existing, tired of tiptoeing around, tired of trying to be the woman he wanted, when I didn't even know who I was anymore. Ryan started controlling everything. The money, the purchases, the visits. He said it was for our own good, and I believed him. When Mom died, she left me a simple silver necklace. One day he looked at me and said, "That makes you look old." And I took it off. I never wore it again. His words carried the weight of orders. Don't talk to so-and-so. Don't go out alone. Don't answer the phone. And I obeyed, because disobeying was costly. Sometimes he wouldn't speak to me for days. When he returned, he'd pretend nothing had happened. And I followed him in this silent theater. There was one particular night I'll never forget. I made baked chicken, his favorite dish. He came home late, looked at the food and said, "Chicken again?" I tried to smile, explaining that was what we had. He threw the plate on the floor. The sound still echoes in my memory. After that day, I realized the house was no longer mine. I was an unwanted guest in my own life. Every step, every gesture, felt like a risk. The children's laughter was the only sound that reminded me that there was still something pure within that hell. Over time, I began to get used to it, to normalize the absurd. He called me useless, and I thought maybe he was right. When you hear the same lie 1,000 times, it starts to seem true. And the worst part was, I no longer had the strength to argue. The church became my refuge. It was the only place I could breathe. But even then, he began to accompany me. He stayed by my side the whole time, observing whoever spoke to me. It was strange. The man who preached about love watched me like someone guarding a prisoner. People admired our perfect marriage. The ladies at church said, "You're an example." And I smiled, as if it were all true. Sometimes I looked at the cross on the altar and wondered if God saw what I was going through. I wanted to believe that he did. The children began to notice. Alex asked me why Dad was yelling so much. Kayla cried in secret. Emily, too young to understand, flinched when he raised his voice. And I, helpless, told them that Dad loved them, while praying that someday it would be true. One afternoon, He arrived with flowers. He said he was sorry, that he wanted to start over. I cried, believing once again that love could change people. And that night, he was sweet. But the next day, it all came back. Only worse. Always worse. I began to notice he wanted to isolate me. He said the phone was expensive, so he cut it off. He said the internet corrupted women, so he took it off. I found myself trapped, friendless, voiceless, with no way out. And the scariest part, I wasn't even trying to get out anymore. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. The sparkle in my eyes was gone. My face was lined with sadness. Sometimes I ran my finger over my skin and wondered when I had aged so much. Not in years, but in pain. He said, God chose him to correct me. I believed him out of fear. Because when someone uses God's name to hurt you, the guilt becomes confusing. I prayed, asking for forgiveness for sins I didn't even know existed. And I felt I deserved every humiliation. One night I dreamed about Mom. She looked at me intently and said, Rachel, get up. I woke up crying. I looked to the side and saw Ryan sleeping. The light from the lamp illuminated his face. Peaceful, almost angelic. It was hard to believe that same face hurt me so much. The scars weren't always visible. Sometimes they were sharp words, hard looks, calculated silences. And what hurt most was knowing no one would believe him. He was loved, respected, a man of God. And I was just his weary wife. One day, he forbade me from going to the women's service. He said it was nonsense. I tried to argue, and he approached slowly, with that familiar look in his eyes. Are you going to challenge me? He asked. I backed away. And inside me, something died. Once again. The children grew up and learned to be quiet. Our conversations were reduced to whispers. Fear became our language. When the front door slammed, everyone held their breath. It was like living in a minefield. Sometimes I wondered, when did I cease to exist? I had dreams, plans, laughter. Now, I just counted the days in silence, waiting for some miracle to happen. But miracles sometimes come disguised as courage. And I didn't know it yet, but mine was coming. One morning, Ryan announced he was going to Cleveland for a course. I smiled, relieved to have a few days of peace. Little did I know this would be the prelude to something terrible. The kind of event that changes everything, and reveals who you truly are when fear tries to destroy you. I began to pray more. I read the 27th Psalm every night. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Of whom shall I be afraid? It was the only phrase that kept me going. I repeated it silently, as if it were a key unlocking an invisible door within me. There were times when I thought about running away. I'd grab my keys, look at the sleeping children, and freeze. Because where would I go? Who would believe me? Shame was a prison, and I no longer knew if there was a way out. But there was a voice, soft, persistent, that told me to resist. Sometimes it sounded like my mother's voice. Other times, like God's own voice. It's not the end yet, she'd say. And even without understanding, I kept believing. I began hiding money in small places around the house. Inside a Bible, in the flower jar, under the mattress. It wasn't much, but it was a symbol. A seed of freedom. And each coin I saved was a silent prayer. Ryan noticed I was different. He began to observe me more closely. He asked where I was going, what I was thinking, who I was dreaming about. I answered as little as possible. Because I already knew, at any moment, he could explode. The children were sleeping earlier now. Their laughter had become rare. The house, once vibrant, was now nothing but echo. And I, between prayers, began to understand that God didn't want me imprisoned. He wanted me alive. But to do that, I would have to do something unthinkable. And that's how the disappearance ended. Not because I was back to my old self, but because I realized that either I disappeared for good, or I ran for my life. Hell had a name, and I slept beside it every night. That night, I knelt at the foot of my bed and asked God for one thing: a sign, a push, a miracle. And he answered me, not with words, but with a deep sense that my deliverance was closer than I could have imagined. The church has always been my refuge. When the world seemed to be falling apart, I would hide between those wooden pews and the soft sound of the choir. The scent of the candles, the echo of the prayers, everything reminded me of my mother. It was the only place where I still felt God saw me. But over time, even that shelter began to change. Ryan began accompanying me to every service. He sat next to me, firmly, with his arm draped over the back of the pew, a gesture that felt like affection but was actually control. I could feel the weight of his watchfulness in every breath. He was loved by everyone. A man of faith, they said. Always smiling, always willing to help. And I, just the silent wife beside him. People saw a perfect couple, and that hurt more than any slap. Because his disguise was too beautiful to be doubted. I remember one Sunday when the pastor preached on forgiveness. Ryan squeezed my hand tightly, giving me that look that said, "Did you hear that?" I forced a smile and nodded. But inside, a scream echoed, "This is not what God wants from me." I searched for answers in Scripture. I read Matthew, Romans, and the Psalms. But each verse seemed to blur together in my mind. Was marriage truly forever, even when it hurt? Or was I confusing faith with fear? One time, I went to the pastor's wife. I told her a little, very little, about what I was going through. She looked at me tenderly and said, "Rachel, pray more. God changes hearts." I left with more guilt than relief. Because I was already praying. The problem was, his heart wouldn't change. The church walls, which once embraced me, now seemed to suffocate me. I listened to the hymns and felt ashamed. Not because I was a bad wife, but because I was living a lie. While everyone sang about freedom, I was a prisoner inside my home. Still, I kept going. It was the only place where I could cry without explanation. I just had to close my eyes and say it was the Holy Spirit's emotion. No one could imagine I just wanted to scream. And maybe, somehow, God understood this kind of silent prayer. The women in the congregation often praised me. They said I had a blessed marriage. How lucky I was to have a man so dedicated to his faith. I would smile and say, "Amen." But each amen sounded like a confession of fear. One cold night, Ryan woke me up, telling me we needed to pray together. He spoke aloud, asking God to make me more submissive, more obedient. I wept as he prayed, and he interpreted my tears as repentance. Deep down, I just wanted to disappear. Faith, which had always set me free, began to imprison me. Because every time I thought about leaving, I remembered the pastor's words, "Marriage is a sacred covenant." And I trembled. Not out of respect for God, but out of fear of challenging what everyone believed to be right. One afternoon after church, an elder said to me, "Rachel, love is sacrifice." That pierced me like a knife. Was this the answer I was looking for? That to love meant to die slowly? I remained silent. But inside me, something began to rebel. One day Ryan preached for the first time. He spoke about male leadership, about how the man should be the leader of the home. The people applauded him. And deep down, I felt sick. Because what he said in the pulpit was the opposite of what he did at home. After that service, several women came up to me, overcome with emotion. "Your husband is a blessing," they said. I smiled, but I wanted to scream, "You don't know what happens when the door to our house closes." But I didn't scream. Because the shame was still greater than the pain. Prayers became disguises. I would kneel beside him and ask forgiveness for things that weren't my fault. Sometimes he would even correct me in my prayers. "You're asking wrong," he would say. And I would change the words, trying to please him, trying to survive. One night I walked to the altar alone. I waited for everyone to leave and then knelt. I asked for a sign, any sign. Tears streamed hotly onto the cold church floor. And in that silence I heard, not a voice but a firm thought, I didn't raise you to live like this. I returned home with that echo in my mind. It was like a spark lit in the darkness. But Ryan noticed. Why are you different? He asked. I brushed it off, saying it was just fatigue. But he looked at me suspiciously. And I knew. He sensed something was changing. He began to surround me even more rigidly. He said the devil was trying to keep me away from him. That I needed to pray more, fast, and purify myself. And I obeyed, but inside, I no longer prayed for him. I prayed for God to pull me out of that abyss. One Sunday, the pastor spoke about the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31. I listened quietly and realized that no one talked about the price of being virtuous. No one said how much it might cost. And at that moment, I began to doubt the whole thing. The words, God is love, began to take on new meaning. Because God's love doesn't imprison. It liberates, heals, and lifts us up. And if what I was experiencing was called love, then God wasn't there. This realization frightened me, but it also gave me courage. One morning before church, I looked at my reflection and said softly, I'm not going to die like this. It was the first time in years I'd heard my own voice firmly. And for a moment, I felt Mom standing there, smiling, saying, This is it, Rachel. This is how it begins. But Ryan noticed this change. You're becoming rebellious, he said. And that same week, he began preaching at home. He read verses about submission and obedience. He said God spoke through him. I listened silently, but inside, I no longer believed. The weight of hypocrisy crushed me. How could a man use God's name to hurt? How could an entire church applaud this? I wanted to disappear. But every time I thought about giving up my faith, I remembered something my mother had said, don't confuse God with men. These words were my relief. I realized that God wasn't on that altar of judgment. He was with me, in my silent tears, in my hidden prayers. He didn't want me to stay, he wanted me to be free. One Wednesday night, there was a healing service. The pastor called forward all those who wanted deliverance. My heart raced. I almost went. But Ryan's gaze locked on me. He held my hand tightly. And there, in that gesture, I understood what spiritual imprisonment was. After that day, I stopped trying to change Ryan. I started changing myself. Inside. I kept silent where there had been supplication. I feigned obedience, but it was strategy. Because I understood that sometimes God doesn't change the scenario. He teaches you to escape at the right time. One night while he slept, I wrote a note. Lord, show me the way. I slipped it into my Bible. As I closed the book, I felt a different kind of peace. It was as if God himself had whispered to me, hang on a little longer. The moment will come. And the moment arrived, in a way I never imagined. On an ordinary day, in a room full of people, with a pen in his hand and hatred in his eyes. It was there, in front of everyone, that the disguise fell, and hell showed its true face. That day started like any other, but I sensed something different in the air. Ryan was strange, quieter than usual, and his gaze, cold. So cold that the coffee seemed to lose its flavor. I knew, deep down, that something bad was about to happen. I just didn't know how bad. He was taking a rehabilitation course in Cleveland, an attempt to improve himself as a man of God. It was the church itself that encouraged him. It will do you good, I said, trying to believe. Perhaps, far from me, he would find what he claimed to seek, peace. But peace was the last thing he brought that day. I arrived at the auditorium for the couple's talk, the last of the course. I wanted to show my support, even though I didn't understand why. The room was packed, people laughing, praying. And there in the back, him. In a suit, with a smile that chilled me. Ryan asked me to sit next to him. I tensed, but I obeyed. He took my hand, squeezing it tightly, almost imperceptibly. He whispered, You'll behave today, okay? I smiled, feigning calm. But inside, my heart was beating like a war drum. The speaker was talking about love and forgiveness. I tried to focus, but I could feel his gaze burning into my skin. With every laugh I gave, he stared back at me. And then it happened. Something so quick and unexpected that it took seconds for my mind to process. He pulled a pen from his pocket. A simple blue pen. I didn't even notice when he held it tightly. Halfway through a question, I felt the tip pierce my arm. It was like a shock. I gasped, looked at him, and saw the smile. A serene, cruel smile. The people around me thought I'd accidentally stabbed myself. No one saw what he whispered immediately afterward. If you embarrass me again, I'll kill you. The words pierced me like invisible blades. I froze. I didn't scream. I just prayed silently. For the rest of the lecture, I sat motionless. The physical pain was nothing compared to the fear. He laughed, answered questions, chatted with the other men, as if nothing had happened. The wound on my arm stung, but what really burned was the dread of what would come next. When the event was over, he walked me to his car. The drive back was deathly silent. Just the sound of the engine and the wind hitting the windshield. I held my arm, blood slowly seeping under my coat. He looked straight ahead and said, "Now you know what I'm capable of." When I got home, the kids ran to hug me. I smiled, hiding the pain. Ryan went straight upstairs. I went to the bathroom, washed the wound, and cried. Not because of the wound, but because, for the first time, I understood that he might actually carry out his threat. That night, he came down with an eerie calm. He sat at the table, picked up his Bible, and began reading aloud. "Wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord." Then he closed the book, looked at me, and said, "If you disobey me again, God will not save you." I slept little, or tried to sleep. The sound of his breathing beside me sounded like the roar of a sleeping monster. I rolled over, my body trembling, and prayed softly, "Lord, protect me. Show me a way." And it was the first time I felt God truly heard me. In the morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He made coffee, played with the kids, complimented the dress I was wearing. I looked at him and thought, how can someone be so two-in-one? A saint for everyone, and a devil just for me. At lunch, he started talking about moving to another city. He said God was guiding our steps toward a new phase. I knew what that meant. Total isolation. He wanted to cut me off from any possibility of help. And I needed to act fast. I snuck my phone in and tried to call a friend from church. But he walked into the room right away. "Who do you talk to so much?" he asked. I told him it was about the choir. He took the phone from me, hung up, and said, "You don't need any choir anymore." That night, he packed his bags. He said we were going to Cleveland for good. No one will interfere in our lives there. His words froze me. I knew, if I left, I would never come back. I would never see my children again. I would never be free again. When the kids were asleep, he sat on the couch and began cleaning a gun. I'd never seen one before. He said it was to protect the family. But the way he looked at me while he cleaned, there was no doubt who he was trying to protect from whom. I tried to feign calm, offered him coffee, and told him about the children. He responded without emotion. Suddenly, he placed the gun on the table and said, "Rachel, if you ever leave me, I'll find you. Neither the police nor God can hide you from me." I stood there, motionless. The world spun slowly, as if time had stopped. He laughed, as if he'd said something funny. Then he went upstairs to his room, leaving the gun on the table. And it was in that instant that an idea was born. Small, dangerous, but alive. I waited for the sound of his footsteps to fade. I carefully picked up the gun and hid it inside the oven, under the old cookie tray. I didn't know what I would do with it. But I knew I couldn't leave it within his reach. It was the first time in years I'd done something without his permission. The next day, he forced me to accompany him back to the course, saying that a couple of faith does not live apart. I went silent, but inside me a flame began to grow. Something inside me, perhaps God, perhaps instinct, whispered, "The time is coming." During the break, I walked away and went into the bathroom. I washed my face, looked in the mirror, and saw a woman I didn't recognize. But there was something new in her eyes. Courage. I took a deep breath and whispered, "I will survive, even if it's the last thing I do." When I returned, Ryan was surrounded by people. He was preaching, gesturing, and seemed inspired. But I saw something else. I saw the fury hidden behind that holy theater. It was like looking at a volcano disguised as a mountain. On the way back, he was silent. Only when he parked the car did he turn to me and say, "You'll never escape me, Rachel." His voice was low but sharp. I smiled, feigning calm, and replied, "I know." But deep down, I was praying otherwise. That night, I packed the children's bags in silence. One item at a time. One souvenir at a time. I packed them inside the old suitcase and hid them in the basement closet. I didn't have a complete plan, but I had something he never imagined I'd have again: hope. Before bed, I went to the children's room. I kissed each of them, lingeringly. I whispered a prayer over them. "Lord, give me time. Just a little more time." And when I turned out the light, I realized the real miracle wasn't escaping. It was having the courage to try. Ryan entered the room soon after. He hugged me from behind, as if nothing had happened, and whispered, "Tomorrow everything changes." I knew he was talking about the trip. But what he didn't know was that yes, everything would change. Just not in the way he expected. I woke before sunrise. The silence in that house seemed heavier than ever. I could hear the wind knocking at the window, the faint sound of the refrigerator, his breathing in the next room. My body trembled, but it wasn't from the cold, it was from fear. Fear and determination. The previous night still echoed in my head. "Tomorrow everything changes," he had said. And I knew what that meant. Ryan had plans. And none of them involved my freedom. So before dawn I said my first prayer out loud, "Lord, guide my steps." I descended the stairs carefully, each step a challenge. The gun was still in the oven, just as I'd left it. I looked at it and understood, that wasn't what would save me. I needed to escape, alive, without violence, without further pain. Only God and my feet would be enough. I grabbed the bag I'd hidden in the basement. My clothes were wrinkled, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the silence. I could hear the ticking of the living room clock as if it were the sound of my heart. 1 second off, and all would be lost. I went to the children's room. They were sleeping soundly, with that peace I envied so much. I stroked Kayla's hair and whispered, "Mommy loves you. I'll come back for you, I promise." Tears fell, but I couldn't let them weaken me now. I took out the little money I'd hidden in my Bible. It was enough for a bus. Maybe 2. I put it in my purse and looked around one last time. That home, once a dream, now felt like a tomb. I needed to get out of there before the sun betrayed me. When I opened the door, the sound of the hinges sounded like a scream. I waited, holding my breath. No movement. No sound from his room. I walked barefoot to the gate. The cold ground beneath my feet was a mixture of pain and freedom. Each step felt like an eternity. The sky was beginning to lighten, painted gray and orange. I looked up and thought of Mom. "I'm going, Mom," I whispered. And in that instant, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. True faith. I ran down the street like someone fleeing hell. The houses were still asleep, the world still unaware of my escape. Only the wind knew. It hit my face, mixing tears and courage. I had no destination, only the certainty that to stay was to die. I heard a car start up behind me, and my body froze. I looked quickly. It wasn't him, it was a neighbor leaving early for work. Even so, my heart raced. That made me realize the depth of the trauma I carried. His fear lived inside me. I arrived at the bus station with my body sweating and my legs shaking. I bought the first ticket I saw. Destination: Chicago. It didn't matter where to, as long as it was far. The attendant looked at me strangely. "Are you okay?" she asked. I just smiled. "I am now." I sat in the last seat and leaned my head against the window. When the engine started, I closed my eyes. The bus's roar was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. For the first time in years, I was leaving, not just from him, but from the woman I'd become by his side. During the journey, I watched the sun rise. And it was like seeing God embrace me. Golden light streamed through the windows, washing away old tears from my face. I felt a lump in my throat, but also immense relief. I was alive. And for the first time, master of my own destiny. But the peace didn't last long. As the bus made its first stop, my phone vibrated. It was him. Ryan. The name flashed across the screen like a threat. I held the phone in my hands, trembling, and then turned it off. The feeling was almost sacred. The next few hours were long. Every bend in the road felt like a new beginning. Every mile, a liberation. But along with hope came guilt. Guilt for leaving the children, for lying, for running away. Until an inner voice whispered, "God is with them." In a moment of distraction, I looked outside and saw a billboard that read, "Freedom starts with faith. Freedom begins with faith." I felt a shiver. It was as if heaven itself were speaking to me. I took a deep breath and let the fear go, at least for a few minutes. I arrived in Chicago early in the morning. The city seemed immense, alive, indifferent to my past. I got off the bus and stood on the sidewalk, unsure of where to go. I had a suitcase, a few dollars, and a faith that barely fit inside me. It was little, but it was everything. I walked to a corner where there was a sign, Community Health Clinic. I walked in without thinking. The smell of coffee and disinfectant hit me. A woman looked at me sweetly and said, "Honey, are you okay?" I broke down. The tears came like a hurricane that had been held back for years. She took me to a small room, offered me water, let me breathe. "You're safe here," she said. I wanted to believe. For the first time, someone didn't doubt me. Someone saw me as a victim, not as guilty. And that was more healing than any medicine. I told her everything. Every detail, every fear, every threat. Her hands shook as she wrote. She didn't judge, didn't question my faith, didn't tell me to pray more. She just said, "You did what you had to do to live." And I cried, because no one had ever said that to me. Soon after, 2 social workers arrived. One of them looked me in the eye and said, "Rachel, from now on, you're not alone." I had no idea how much I needed to hear those words. They explained to me about shelters, protection, legal measures. It all seemed like a distant dream. They gave me clean clothes, hot coffee, and a blanket. I sat there, wrapped in my arms, listening to the noise of the world outside. For the first time, the silence wasn't a threat, it was rest. While I waited, a nurse came in and took my hand. "Do you believe in God?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled. "Then know that He brought you here for a reason. No escape is accidental." And that struck me like a light. Hours later, a police officer came in to question me. I told him everything again, my voice trembling but firm. He took notes silently, respectfully. When I finished, he simply said, "You're a survivor." I'd never thought of myself that way. When the clock struck 11, a van arrived. "It's from the shelter," they said. I looked out the window and saw a woman waving. My heart pounded. It was the next step, the first day of the rest of my life. Before leaving, I looked up at the sky and murmured, "Thank you, Lord." Because, despite everything, I was alive. And even though there was still pain, fear, and longing, there was also something new being born. A faith that was more mature, freer, more my own. As the van pulled away from the clinic, I thought about the children. About the promise I made to Kayla. I would return for them, in due time. But first, I needed to rebuild myself. And I knew God was guiding me. I closed my eyes, feeling the wind blow through the window. For the first time, that wind didn't remind me of danger. It was the breath of life. The sound of the road was like a chant. And within me a phrase echoed. I survived. But the journey was far from over. The final destination was a safe house in Chicago. And there, behind a door bearing another woman's name, I would discover what safety truly was, and what it meant to start over. The van stopped in front of a simple but welcoming building. The sign read, Elsa Soares Women's Shelter. I had never heard that name, but the sound of the word shelter, it seemed like a miracle. Shelter. Refuge. The kind of word that saves when everything else falls apart. The door opened, and a gray-haired woman greeted me with a smile. Welcome, dear. No one has to pretend to be okay here. I nearly broke down again. There was something in her voice, a mixture of firmness and tenderness, that made me feel, for the first time, safe. The hallway smelled of soap and fresh coffee. Colorful paintings lined the walls, and women's voices echoed from afar. Nothing here resembled the cold, institutional places I feared. It was warm, human. A small piece of heaven hidden amid the chaos of the city. The woman introduced herself. I'm Elsa. You can call me Ellie. The name sounded familiar, almost as if I'd known her for years. She led me to a simple room with a bed, a blue blanket, and a Bible on the small table. You can rest now, she said. You're safe. I sat on the bed and let my body sink in. The mattress was hard, but the sensation was as soft as hope. I looked out the window and saw the sun rising over Chicago. And I realized that the same sun that was rising for everyone else was rising for me too. I was alive. As I sipped the coffee Ellie brought, I observed the other women. Some were talking quietly, others just stared into space. Each had their own war in their eyes. But they had something in common, a shy gleam of someone who still believed in a new beginning. Ellie sat next to me and said, You know, Rachel, sometimes God doesn't take us out of the storm. He teaches us to dance in the rain. I smiled, tears welling in my eyes. She sounded like my mother. Those words fell on my heart like a bomb. Late that afternoon, a social worker came to talk to me. Here you have a right to everything. Food, protection, and therapy. I nodded, somewhat in disbelief. She continued, but most of all, we want you to remember who you are. Because he tried to erase you, and failed. That night, I lay down and stared at the ceiling. The sound of cars outside was distant, almost comforting. For the first time, silence didn't frighten me. It was the sound of peace. I closed my eyes and thought of God. Thank you for bringing me here, I whispered. The next few days were slow. There was a routine, schedules, meetings, prayers. Everything was new, everything was strange. I felt like a child learning to walk again. Sometimes I stumbled, sometimes I cried, but Ellie always said, every tear is now of cleansing, not of pain. I met other women. One, Lisa, had fled with a young son. Another, Marcia, had left everything behind, including her own name. Each story was a mirror of what evil can do, and what God can rebuild. Sometimes we laughed together. Laughter seemed forbidden at first, as if joy were a betrayal of pain. But Ellie said, laughter is resistance. Then one day, I really laughed. A laugh that started softly and ended in tears. It was beautiful. It was human. In the afternoons, I helped in the kitchen. The smell of baking bread reminded me of my childhood with my mother. Sometimes I would close my eyes and could almost hear her singing. It was as if she were there, saying, See, daughter? I told you true love never hurts. One day, Ellie called me in for a chat. Rachel, we believe in starting over with purpose here. Have you thought about what you want to do with your life now? The question caught me off guard. I was silent for a moment. I want to learn to live again, I replied. She smiled. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to teach you how to live again. And I believed her. For the first time in a long time, someone was offering me something Ryan never had: choice. Nights were the hardest time. Fear still appeared sometimes, in dreams, in the early morning noises. But now I knew that fear no longer ruled me. I acknowledged it, talked to it, and let it go. One night during prayer group, Ellie asked each woman to write down what she most desired. I wrote just one word: peace. I folded the paper and put it in the basket. When she read it aloud, she looked at me and said, "God will give it to you, in His own time." And He did. Little by little, in small doses. In a hot cup of tea in the morning, in Lisa's embrace, in Marsha's laughter. Peace didn't come like a storm, it came like a breeze. One day, I received a surprise visit. The police officer who had helped me. "How are you?" he asked. "Breathing better," I replied. He smiled and said, "Then you're winning." That made me think. Winning isn't about forgetting. It's about continuing despite everything. Over time, I began to help other new women who arrived. I'd tell them a little about my story, without going into details. I'd simply say, if you've made it this far, you've already won half the battle. I saw hope in their eyes, and that strengthened me. One day, Ellie called me and said, "We have a spot on a training course. Community management and outreach. I think it's for you." I hesitated, but she insisted, "Rachel, the future needs you." And in that moment, I realized she might be right. I accepted. And it was like opening a new door inside me. A hidden door, as Ellie liked to say. A door that had always been there, but that fear had kept locked. Now, I turned the key for the first time. On the first day of class, my hands were shaking. I felt too old, too weak. But when I saw other women sitting there, with similar stories, I realized I wasn't alone. Each of us was a survivor, and survivors always find strength. Going back to school gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost: dignity. Every new word I learned was a building block in rebuilding my identity. And the more I studied, the more I believed there was still life in me. In one of my classes, the teacher asked, "What does freedom mean to you?" I thought for a moment and replied, "Freedom is sleeping without fear." The room fell silent. And in that moment, I realized that my scars could teach me something too. Shelter began to become my new home. The walls held stories. The hallways, prayers. Every corner held the strength of someone who, like me, refused to die in silence. And it was beautiful to see how God stitched together new lives within. One morning, Ellie handed me a small wooden cross. "Made by a woman who was here before you," she said. She said that every cross carried with faith becomes a bridge. I held that symbol and wept. Because, for the first time, it wasn't pain, it was gratitude. I wasn't the same Rachel anymore. The frightened woman had been left behind, back in Detroit, along with the fear. Now, I was someone learning to exist again, to breathe, to believe. And it was in this mix of faith and fragility that I began to prepare for the next step. The shelter provided me with physical shelter, but what came next would be even greater. Learning to live, not just survive. Because true freedom was not in the doors that closed, but in the one that, one day, finally opened, the door hidden inside me. Relearning to breathe seems simple, but for me it was the greatest challenge of all. I no longer knew what it meant to fill my lungs without fear. Each breath brought with it memories, voices, echoes of the past. But little by little, the air began to return. And with it, life. The first few days of the course were difficult. I felt like an outsider, as if everyone there had come from a world where fear didn't exist. But Ellie always said, "You belong in this new time, Rachel. Take a deep breath and keep going." So I breathed. Once, twice, 1,000 times. Therapy at the shelter became my second foundation. The therapist, a woman named Grace, had eyes that seemed to see beyond the pain. "You're not broken," she said. "You've only been shaped by survival." Those words healed parts of me I hadn't even known were broken. During the sessions, I learned to say out loud what I'd been silently swallowing for years. He hurt me. I was scared. I wanted to die. Each sentence was a release. It hurt, but it was a good pain, like pulling out a thorn to let the blood flow again. Grace taught me something simple and profound. Breathing is trust. When you inhale, trust that the air will come. When you exhale, trust that it will return. And I realized that for a long time, I had forgotten how to trust, even myself. Little by little, I began to enjoy the mornings. Before, sunrise had brought me anxiety. Now, it reminded me of a new beginning. The sound of birds, the smell of coffee in the shelter kitchen. Everything felt sacred. Small miracles I'd never seen before. Lisa and Marcia became my traveling companions. We laughed. We cried. We reminisced. Sometimes we shared our fears and laughed at them too. If we're laughing, it's because we've overcome a little, Marcia would say. And it was true. In the late afternoons, I walked through the shelter's garden. The flowers were simple but resilient. Like us. One of them caught my eye. A flowering cactus, beautiful even in the dryness. I looked at it and thought, maybe I can bloom too, even if I'm hurt. I started writing again. Short sentences, journals, prayers. Writing was like opening windows within myself. And the more I wrote, the more I remembered who I was before fear. It was like talking to the girl who once dreamed of love and freedom. One morning, Grace asked me to make a list of my favorites. I stood there, staring at the blank paper. 4 years, all I'd done was please someone. Favorites. I didn't know. So with my heart racing I wrote, hot coffee, books, the sound of rain. And that was the beginning of a new me. Returning to school brought me pride. I sat in the front rows, took notes, asked questions. Knowledge gave me something it had always denied me, a voice. Every word I learned was a weapon against the past. But freedom is also scary. Sometimes I'd wake up sweating, afraid he was there, watching me. Trauma has that power. It disguises itself as a shadow. On those days, I'd repeat the verse Ellie taught me. Fear doesn't come from God, but power, love, and a sound mind. The police officers' visits became less frequent, but I still saw the patrol car occasionally on the street outside the shelter. Knowing someone was watching from afar gave me security. It was as if God had placed invisible sentinels around me. One day during class, the teacher asked, "What's your biggest dream right now?" And without thinking I replied, "To be able to breathe without guilt." The class fell silent. The teacher smiled and said, "So, keep breathing, Rachel. One day, you'll make other women breathe too." That day, I returned to the shelter and cried with gratitude. Because, for the first time, I believed that my suffering could generate something good. That perhaps my pain could be the seed for other liberations. Ellie watched me fondly. "You're blooming," she said. "But be careful, flowers born in the desert need sun and patience." I understood. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to live with the scars and still keep smiling. One Sunday, we were invited to a special service at a local church. At first, I hesitated. I was afraid of the sermons, which always used the Bible to imprison me. But Ellie insisted, "Not every church is a prison, Rachel. Some are wings." I entered the temple with a heavy heart. The lights were soft, the voices gentle. The pastor spoke about love as a choice, not an obligation. And halfway through the sermon he said, "Forgiveness isn't about returning to the pain. It's about letting go of what holds you back so you can move forward." I cried. It was God speaking to me. After the service, a woman hugged me and said, "Honey, what you've been through doesn't define who you are." I almost broke down. Because I still saw myself as a victim, and she called me a woman. It was the first time I'd heard that without fear. The following days were filled with small victories. I laughed without guilt, ate slowly, and slept without guarding the door. Sometimes I still had nightmares, but I would wake up, look at the ceiling, and say, I'm safe. And that was enough to put me back to sleep. I began helping Grace in group sessions. I listened to the other women tell their stories and saw versions of myself in them. It was painful and beautiful at the same time. Each one brought her own wounds, but also her own strength. In one of these circles, a woman said, "I just want to know who I am without him." And I responded without thinking, "You are who God saw before he struck you." The words came out of me like a revelation. And in that instant, I realized, my voice was coming back. Over time, I began walking alone through the city. The noise, the movement, the life, everything seemed immense. I passed a bookstore and bought a new notebook. I wrote on the cover, "New Breath." Because that was exactly what I was experiencing. A new breath. I received an email from a former church colleague in Detroit. She had heard about me from someone. "Rachel, we're praying for you. God has a bigger plan." I read those words and felt peace. Because, for the first time, I believed it without fear. At the graduation ceremony, we all wore simple clothes, but we smiled like queens. Ellie made sure to be there. When my name was called, she gave a standing ovation. I held the diploma and felt a chill. It was the symbol that the cycle of fear had been broken. After the ceremony, I sat alone on a park bench and looked up at the sky. I thought about everything I'd lost, but also about everything I'd gained. "Thank you, Lord, for teaching me to breathe again," I whispered. And the wind responded, soft, steady, as if to say, "I am here." That night, in the shelter, I slept peacefully. I dreamed of the sea. I walked on the sand, the sun on my face, and in the background a voice said, "Tell your story." I woke with my heart racing. Maybe it was just a dream. Or maybe it was a calling. The next morning, I told Ellie about my dream. She smiled. When healing finds voice, testimony is born. "It's time to speak, Rachel." I was silent for a moment, startled by the thought. But something inside me knew, she was right. Because there are liberations that are not completed in silence. And I was ready to use my voice not only to breathe, but to heal. The first time I was asked to tell my story, my hands shook. Ellie called me one afternoon and said, "Rachel, the community center is hosting a conversation about starting over. I think it's your time." I laughed nervously. "My time? I'm still learning how to live." She took my hands and replied, "And that's why they need to hear you. Because no one understands pain like someone who survived it." I remained silent, feeling the weight and beauty of those words. It was fear, and calling all at once. The night before the event, I couldn't sleep. I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering every detail of my journey. The scars, the fear, the escape. And I thought, am I ready for this? But then a gentle voice, the one I always recognize as God, whispered, "You don't have to be ready. You just have to be honest." I arrived at the community center with my heart racing. The chairs were arranged in a circle, the smell of coffee was in the air, women of all ages were chatting quietly. I saw an untold story in each face. And that's when I realized, this wasn't about me. It was about all of us. When my name was called, time seemed to stop. I stood up, took a deep breath, the same air I'd been missing for so long, and began. "My name is Rachel Parker, and for many years I thought love and pain were the same thing." The silence was absolute. No one coughed. No one touched their cell phone. I continued, my voice wavering. I grew up believing that love was about holding on. That faith was about keeping quiet. But God taught me otherwise. Love doesn't hurt, and faith doesn't imprison. The words came out with tears. I told her about the girl from Detroit, about the woman who believed too much, about the dawn escape. Each memory was a wound being exposed, but also healing. I looked out at the audience and saw teary eyes. Some women shook their heads, others held each other's hands. I realized I wasn't the only one who'd lived through the hell of a seemingly holy home. And that freed me even more. For a long time, I said, I believed God wanted me to stay. Today I understand He wanted me to live. The audience murmured a soft amen. I took a deep breath. The guilt began to lift from my chest, replaced by something new: purpose. I told her about the shelter, about Ellie, about Grace, about the day I learned to breathe again. God didn't save me from the storm, He taught me to swim, I said. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just talking about my story anymore. I was talking about every woman who still remained silent. A young woman raised her hand and asked, "But don't you feel angry? Don't you feel like hating him?" I smiled sadly. Yes, I did. For a long time. But I've discovered that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about stopping letting it define me. Grace, my therapist, was in the audience. She looked at me with pride. Later, she would tell me that she had never seen someone transform pain into faith with such truth. But in that moment, all I could do was cry, not with sadness, but with gratitude. At the end of the circle, a woman approached. She was trembling, her eyes welling up with tears. "Daughter, I've been through the same thing. I've been silent for 40 years. I hugged her, and she cried on my shoulder. "You gave me courage," she said. And it was then that I understood the true power of my voice. Back at the shelter, Ellie was waiting for me with tea and a smile. "So?" she asked. I replied, my eyes still red. It was like breathing in front of God. She smiled. "Now you understand. Speaking out is freeing those who are still trapped." In the following days, they began inviting me to other circles, other conversations. Sometimes at churches, other times at schools, shelters, small groups. Each time I told my story, a piece of me healed a little more. Some women looked at me with admiration, as if I were stronger than I really was. But I always said, the strength didn't come from me. It came from the God who stayed with me when everyone else left. And it was this truth that sustained me. One day, I was invited to speak on a local radio station. "Rachel, we want to share your story of overcoming obstacles." I hesitated. Microphones still scared me. But Ellie told me, "Your story no longer fits within 4 walls. The world needs to hear it." In the studio, when the lights came up and the announcer gave me the signal, I closed my eyes for a moment. I took a deep breath. And I said the words that had become my motto: "Faith doesn't mean silence. Love doesn't hurt." My voice was firm, clear, and the air seemed to vibrate around me. When the program ended, I received dozens of messages. Some thanking me, others venting. Women said, "You told my story." I cried reading each one. And I understood. God made me a messenger, not a victim. Time passed, and my life began to take on a new rhythm. I continued studying and graduated from my 2nd year of high school. Now I was community transformation agent. And never has a title made so much sense. Transforming pain into change. One night, I sat alone on the shelter's porch, staring out at the city lights. I remembered the day I fled, the cold ground beneath my feet. And I realized that cold had become strength. "Thank you, Lord," I whispered. "Because even when I doubted, you never let go of my hand." Some of the younger women started calling me Mama Rachel. I laughed in surprise. "Why is that?" And they'd reply, "Because when you talk, we believe we can live." That's when I realized, my testimony wasn't just survival, it was inheritance. At a community conference, a pastor invited me to the pulpit. "Speak about faith and courage," she urged. I stepped up with a calm heart. The pulpit, that place that once reminded me of pain, was now an altar of liberation. "For years," I said, "I confused submission with silence. But God showed me that a virtuous woman is not one who keeps silent, she is one who trusts in His love above her fear of men." The entire church stood. I trembled, but not with fear. With power. After that day, I received an unexpected invitation to help coordinate a women's shelter program. I accepted without thinking. Because every time I helped someone, It was as if a part of my old self returned to thank me. On the wall of my room in the shelter, I pasted a sentence I read in a book. Healing is a collective act. Now I understood. I didn't heal alone. It was the hands, the words, the prayers of so many women that stitched my soul together. One Sunday during prayer, I felt a different kind of peace. It wasn't emotion, nor relief, it was fulfillment. The voice within me, firm and serene, said, "Now, tell me what you've learned. Because the desert blooms when someone believes." And it was then that I realized, my life didn't end with the trauma. It began there. The testimony wasn't about pain, but about rebirth. At the end of the meeting, Ellie came over, took my hand, and said, "You're ready to bloom." I smiled, feeling tears in my eyes. "But what if the desert is still inside me?" I asked. She replied, "Even in the desert, the cactus blooms. They say the cactus is the flower that blooms where nothing should grow. And perhaps that's why I've always seen myself in it. Resilient, silent, unlikely. After everything I'd been through, the desert had become my home. But now, for the first time, the desert was blooming. A year had passed since the day I escaped. I still lived in Chicago, but no longer in the shelter. I rented a small apartment near Lake Michigan, with white walls and blue curtains, colors of peace. The mornings there smelled of new beginnings. Working at the community center had become my mission. I helped women who arrived with the same look in their eyes that I once had, the look of someone who carries fear like a second skin. With each story I heard, I saw myself in them. And with each hug, I healed a little more. Ellie said God had turned me into a bridge. "You crossed the desert so others might know the way." I smiled, because now I understood. Suffering didn't destroy me. It shaped me to serve. In my spare time, I began studying psychology. I wanted to understand more deeply what trauma does to the soul, and how faith can mend what pain has torn. It wasn't about a degree, it was about a mission. Every page I studied was a silent prayer. Sometimes, I still dreamed about him. In the dreams, Ryan didn't scream. He just looked at me, confused, lost. And I woke with a peaceful heart. Because there was no more hate. Only compassion. I had learned to let go of even what hurt me. One morning, I sat on the porch and noticed something new. Fear, that companion of so many years, no longer lived with me. In its place, there was silence, but a good silence, full of peace. I took a deep breath, and the air entered me light, sweet, and whole. Kayla now lived with me. She was already a teenager, beautiful and strong. Sometimes she looked at me with the same eyes my mother had. "You're brave, Mom," she'd say. And I'd reply, "No, daughter. Brave is the one who chooses to love again after so much suffering." On weekends, we'd go to Lincoln Park. We'd sit on the grass, eat popcorn, and watch the sunset. I'd hear her laugh, and it was music to my soul. Because in every laugh I heard God say, "I've kept my promise." One day, Ellie came to visit me. She carried a small potted cactus in bloom. "This is for you," she said. "Because blooming in the desert is a rare gift, and you are proof of that." I cried. I placed the pot on the windowsill, where the sun shines every morning. As I watched him, I realized something. Cactus flowers don't bloom every day. They wait for the right time. And when they do, they're too beautiful to go unnoticed. So it is with healing, it comes slowly, but when it arrives, it illuminates everything. Sometimes I still find myself looking up at the sky and asking, "Why me?" But now, the answer is different. It's no longer why me, but why through me. God has transformed my pain into testimony, my scar into a map, my voice into comfort. I attend support groups, conferences, and meetups. And every time a woman hugs me and says, "I thought I was the only one," my heart fills with light. Because there, in that moment, two survivors blossom together. One night I opened my Bible and the old note fell out, the one I wrote asking God for a way. I read the words with tears in my eyes. "Lord, show me the way." And I realized. He showed me. Not a shortcut, but a desert full of miracles. In therapy, Grace asked, "Rachel, what does freedom mean to you today?" I replied, "Freedom is choosing peace, even when the past still whispers." She smiled and said, "Then you get it." I began writing a book about my story. Not out of vanity, but as a legacy. I wanted my daughters, and their daughters, to know that God's love never fails, even when everything else fails. Writing was my longest prayer. In the dedication I wrote, "To all the women who survived the desert, and to the God who made flowers grow in me." When I finished, I felt a peace I'd never felt before. As if my soul had finally found its home. Kayla helped me with the computer. "Mom, you need to be online," she'd say, laughing. "So many people need to hear this." And that was how my first online talk was born. Simple, recorded on a cell phone, but full of truth. The video spread. Thousands of women watched it. Comments came from everywhere. "You saved my life. I decided to leave after your video." I read each one with tears in my eyes. And I thought, that is the purpose. But the most beautiful thing wasn't the fame, it was the renewed faith. Each testimony was an echo of divine goodness. And I understood that the miracle wasn't just escaping. The miracle was continuing to believe in love. One Sunday, during a church event in Ohio, a woman approached with a silver necklace in her hand. "It's for you," she said. "It belonged to my mother. She survived too." When I looked, it was identical to the necklace Ryan had made me take off years ago. I understood. God returns what evil tries to steal. Now, every morning before I leave the house, I put on that necklace. Not as a reminder of the past, but as a symbol of a new beginning. When the cool metal touches my skin, I smile. Because every mark, every tear, every prayer, it was worth it. One day, I took the cactus to the lake. I sat at the water's edge and watched the sun reflect off the waves. I took the pot in my hands and said, "Even in the desert, I bloomed." And the wind blew strongly, as if confirming, "Yes, Rachel, you bloomed." I learned that forgiveness isn't forgetting who hurt you, but remembering without pain. It's looking back and seeing how much you've grown. It's realizing that the desert was a school, and that God never wastes suffering. Today, I wake up and feel no fear. Only gratitude. For the air, for the light, for the people, for every woman who crossed my path. And when I pray, I no longer ask for deliverance, I ask for purpose. Because pain without purpose is a prison, but pain with purpose is a miracle. Sometimes I visit the shelter. I walk the halls and hear new voices, new cries, new laughter. Ellie is still there, steady, with that same look of faith. "Did you come home?" she asks. "No," I reply, smiling. "I never left. I just blossomed." Every now and then, I close my eyes and still hear the sound of the past. The door slamming, the scream, the fear. But it no longer dominates me. Now, it's just a distant memory. A reminder of how God is greater than any pain. I learn to love again. Myself, life, people. And this love is light, clean, free. A love that doesn't hurt, that doesn't hold you back, that doesn't demand. A love that comes from above. And every time I look at the flowering cactus in the window, I remember. Nothing is impossible for those who decide to bloom, even under the hottest sun. Because God always makes life blossom, even in the driest lands. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The miracle is not in never breaking, but in allowing the soul, even when cracked, to blossom again. You know, looking back, I realized that pain was never the end of my story. It was the beginning of the woman I needed to become. I thought God had forgotten me, but he was just preparing me. And maybe he's preparing you too. How many times have you kept quiet out of fear? How many times have you believed that love had to hurt to be real? I believed this for a long time, until I discovered that true love frees, heals, and restores us to ourselves. God's love doesn't shout, doesn't hurt, doesn't hold us back. It whispers, "Get up, daughter." I'm still here. Sometimes the miracle isn't coming out unscathed. It's simply staying standing. Breathing, even when the air hurts. Smiling, even when the past still whispers. And if you're listening to this now, know this. No matter what you've been through, God still has beautiful plans for your life. Have you ever felt something similar? Have you ever found yourself trapped in a love that slowly erased you? Or have you ever had to start over from scratch when you thought you no longer had the strength? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this message touched your heart, if you believe someone else needs to hear it, share it. Sometimes, it's your voice that will save someone who is still silent. Before I finish, I want to bless you with the same words that have sustained me. May God envelop you with His eternal love, give you the courage to rise up and the wisdom to choose peace every day. May He heal your wounds, teach you to breathe again, and transform your pain into strength. And if you want to continue learning about faith, starting over, and purpose, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I promise to continue telling stories that touch the soul, stories that heal, stories that prove it's never too late to blossom. Because in the end, my dear, the desert may be dry, but in every heart that believes, God always makes a flower bloom.